Hi, everybody. Recently, I posted an essay for some students and asked them to write something about it. It was an essay that was written by Jean-Paul Sartre, and it was entitled Existentialism is a Humanism. After that assignment, several students requested that I put up some more information about Sartre in order to help clarify some of the issues that were discussed in that essay. So I'm trying to do that now. So I'm going to make this presentation as a general introduction to existentialism, and it will feature Sartre's contributions to that movement. Just for this first slide and the pictures here, on the top left is Soren Kierkegaard. Underneath Kierkegaard is, as you probably know, Friedrich Nietzsche. Uh, on the top right is Fyodor Dostoevsky, writer, thinker, and underneath him is Jean-Paul Sartre. So these are all significant figures in existentialist movement, and we'll say a little bit more about them as we try to develop the ideas. Existentialism had its beginnings back in the 19th century, although it didn't really become accepted or popular until the 20th century. And that's in after World War II and uh, in the midst of all the devastation that Europe went through as a result of the two world wars that were fought there. In the 19th century, two thinkers, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, are usually given credit for the founding ideas. And they're two very different types of people, but they had a lot of uh, common ideas. Basically, you could say the two of them rejected or reacted to the speculative and rationalistic philosophies that were still popular when they came on the scene. That would be the philosophers such as those of Immanuel Kant and then George Hegel a little bit later. Those are just two samples, though, of that type of philosophy. Gradually, when the movement became popular, it came to have a very widespread cultural influence in a lot of different areas. So clearly, philosophers and writers uh, involved psychologists, scientists, and some filmmakers. Some of the more famous names, we already mentioned Dostoevsky here previously, the Russian novelist, Albert Camus, Samuel Beckett, a playwright, Ingmar Bergman, filmmaker, Franz Kafka, writer, and Martin Heidegger, a philosopher as well. I think I've already mentioned this first point already, so I don't want to do it again. Uh, in general, though, the existentialist philosophers wanted to move away from just talking about general things and wanted to get more into the particulars, wanted to move away from the abstract and address the concrete or the actual lived experience of human beings. In a way, it was kind of trying to bring philosophy down to earth so it dealt with real life kinds of problems and situations that human beings face. Sartre uses this catchphrase, existence precedes essence. And this is a kind of reversal of what Sartre would say traditional philosophy had always, the order in which traditional philosophy had placed these two things. So essence was always believed to be first, and then existence came afterwards. It's kind of like in Plato, you have the form comes first, and then actual concrete particular existence comes second and has a secondary importance. You could say from religious points of view, if you want to say that God created everything, and kind of, the ideas existed in the mind of God. Then they were put into actual existence, but the idea, the essence of what something is, always came first. The existentialist, Sartre in particular, wants to reverse that and say we don't know what the essences of things are. We start with the fact of just mere existence, that we as human beings, we find ourselves in existence, and then we decide what it means that we exist, or we decide what the essence of what we are is. So here there's a new focus. The focus is on what human beings are, not on what they ought to be. I mean, if there's an essence out there, you're always trying to measure up to the essence. But that's no longer the case. And we're not trying to measure ourselves against an ideal or an essence. And we're not even trying to measure ourselves against what's considered natural, as though it precedes the fact that we actually exist. A couple more themes I wanted to include here. The first we already saw in Nietzsche again. Nietzsche sort of thought that human beings are more irrational than they are rational, and that the world is also more irrational than it is rational. And even to the extent where Camus, for instance, a little bit later, is going to say that life is absurd and it just doesn't make any sense at all. And it's sort of, life is fundamentally in itself meaningless unless individual human beings give it meaning, give meaning to their own existence. So that's one theme. And then the second one is this new interest in psychology. You say that begins with Nietzsche, as we already tried to demonstrate. It's also the case in Kierkegaard. They give very in-depth psychological analysis of what it means to be a human being and what's going on beneath the surface. So that becomes a feature of the new movement. Almost all the existentialist thinkers are going to be interested in psychology and can be interested in trying to give psychological explanations for human behaviors. More peculiar to the philosophy of Sartre, I think, is these next two, and sort of a real strong focus on human freedom. And the flip side of human freedom is always human responsibility. Sartre thought that human beings are free in a very radical sense, and because of that, they're also responsible in a very radical sense. We'll look at that more. And the result of this degree of freedom that's part of the human condition, is a kind of uneasiness or anxiety in the human condition, because human beings have to continually be making choices about themselves, about what they're going to do, how to see things and face things and so forth. And there's no objective standards that human beings can appeal to in order to help them make choices. If you say there's no rational uh, nature that human beings can look to, there's no divinity who's going to give you rules that you can live by so that you don't have to give them yourself. All the rules and decisions that you have to make have to come from yourself, but there's no foundation upon which you have to make those calls. This makes it, but still, it affects everything. So there's kind of uneasiness in the human condition as a result of having to make choices all the time. I've included this slide of referencing Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus. And if don't know if you know your Greek mythology, but Sisyphus offended the gods in some way, and he was given this endless punishment of having to roll a heavy boulder up to the top of a mountain. And every time he would get to the top of the mountain, the boulder would get away from him and roll back down to the bottom. And Sisyphus would have to go back down and start all over again and roll the boulder up to the top again. And again, it would get away and roll back down. Camus took this kind of futile effort of Sisyphus and used it to illustrate the absurdity of human existence. This is what human beings do. They work and slave their whole lives trying to achieve something, trying to create something for themselves. And in the end, it's always taken away from them. And the fruits of their labors are not what they think it's going to be. And they have to, it's just endless labor, but never the final reward. That's a pretty bleak story. Camus argues that Sisyphus has to somehow be willing to undertake this endless task without being destroyed by it or depressed, that he kind of, as a kind of metaphysical rebel, accepts his fate. And in his acceptance of his fate, kind of rises above it. So this is his approach to how to live life, which is in an absurd kind of situation to be in, but nonetheless, try to rise above the unpleasantness of it all, and you give yourself some dignity in the process of doing so. We're not able to deal with every aspect of Sartre's philosophy, but I thought we'd try to look at a couple of key distinctions, I think, which tell us something about how he saw things. You see his years here, born in 1905, died in 1980. So he's pretty close to us in time, respect. And clearly you can see that he was French, and he lived through these two world wars. And he was still a young man in World War One, and then still around for World War Two. He fought in the French Resistance. I'm not sure about World War One, but he may have been in the military, and he was captured and imprisoned for a time in, I think, the First World War. And it was while he was in prison, it couldn't have been too horrible for him because he was able to read the works of Martin Heidegger and some other thinker, her name sort of escapes me at the moment, but Yeah, he was able to pursue his educational and his philosophical interest while he was in prison. So he had an interesting life, to say the least. And I don't want to go too much into the details of the rest of it, but this first distinction I've always thought was kind of interesting. He says there's two different kinds of being, two different ways in which we can say that things are said to exist. Some things, he's going to say, have being in itself. You could say that's the being of things. They have a kind of being, it's contained within themselves. It might also apply to animals. Now, the things which have this kind of being don't have any input in terms of what they are. They just are what they are. You say their natures are fixed, and they are what they are by nature. So an animal is what he is. He can't decide what kind of animal he's going to be. He's just determined by his nature. The second kind of being, though, Sartre wants to say is those kinds of things that exist for themselves, being for itself. And by this, he means the being of a human being who has something to say about his own being. You say human beings are unique in this regard, that they make something, they have something to say about what they are or who they are. And so they have input. So their natures aren't fixed, their natures are adaptable, flexible, malleable, maybe. And so that's a pretty important distinction for him. To be part of what it means to be a human being is that you exist for yourself, and you have some input in terms of what you are, maybe like what your essence is, for instance. From this, then, we can see that there are two different ways in which human beings can actually exist. And Sartre's going to say that we can exist in good faith, and which means that I accept that I am free and responsible for myself, responsible for my choices. This is kind of the that I am a being for itself. In other words, I'm a creature who determines for himself what he is and, and takes responsibility for that. So this is being true to what it is that I am. Heidegger uses this term authenticity to mean just about the same thing. For Sartre, it's that you're living in good faith. You've accepted the fact that you're free, and you've accepted the fact that you're responsible for all your choices. You're responsible for yourself. The difficulty of being a human being, having this kind of being, is that it can be burdensome. It's in some place, Sartre says, you think that freedom's wonderful. I mean, everyone wants to be free. But Sartre uses this expression. So human beings are condemned to be free. You can't escape it, which means you can't escape the necessity of making choices for yourself, and you can't escape the necessity of being responsible for your choices. The consequence of this responsibility, this need to always be making choices, is that human beings suffer anxiety about it. It's kind of like you're worried about whether or not you're making the right choices, but really there's no way to know whether your choices are the best ones or not until you make them. So there's kind of uneasiness which is part of the human condition for us. Now, this difficulty or this burdensome aspect of living in good faith, I mean, is people would rather not have to carry that around all the time. So you'll see that there's a tendency in some instances to think of myself as not having a choice. That it's not up to me. I'm determined to be this way or to be that way or to do this or to do that. I don't really have a choice. But when I do that, when I pretend that I don't have a choice, I'm really making something less of myself than what I am. I'm making of myself something which has being in itself. And that's really dishonest. It's kind of inauthentic existence, what Sartre calls bad faith. So the burden of always making choices, always being responsible, I look for ways to get out of that burden. Try to think, try to avoid or deny that I have choices. But that's a negative thing for Sartre. I think one of the interesting things here is this question of values. And this Sartre existentialist, they're often accused of being nihilist. But really, if you look at it, it seems like this is not nihilism. Very few existentialists would admit that there's any kind of external standard that you can use to measure your actions by. That's part of the difficulty in making choices, not having external standards. But here we've just seen that there's a couple values that come close to being just that. There's a couple of values that it looks like the existentialists endorse as though they had worth in themselves. And the first one is honesty. Not honesty with others, but honesty with oneself. You can say, life might not be pretty, but it's better if you see it for what it is. You need to be honest with yourself. You need to have intellectual integrity. And there's a feeling that there's value in that there's value in facing the truth. Wishful thinking, self-deception, those are kind of negative tendencies to be discouraged. They make us less than what we are. I think the same value is found in Nietzsche. Nietzsche thinks that the best thing for a human being is to take on responsibility for himself, to make something of himself. There's a positive value to that, and that if you don't, you're making something less of yourself. Then you're just human, all too human. I mean, you need to rise above yourself, and that's a good thing. Not to rise above yourself, to be part of the herd, that's not a good thing. So honesty seems to have value in itself. The other value is freedom. And not only one's own freedom, but that of others as well kind of has to be acknowledged as part of what it is that is unique about being a human being. It's an essential aspect of what we are, and it needs to be embraced. Again, it's a flaw. I mean, to think of yourself as not being free, to think of yourself as being your actions being determined from outside yourself. So looks to me like these are values that existentialists embrace and endorse. including Sartre. These points are from the essay I mentioned at the beginning, Existentialism as a Humanism, a lecture that Sartre gave in 1946, in which he was defending and further explaining what existentialism was. His claim in that essay was that there are four basic criticisms that are leveled against existentialists, and he identifies them. And then in the rest of the essay, he wants to respond to these particular criticisms. First criticism is that existentialism is an invitation to quietism, of despair. In other words, it leads to passivity or inaction because one feels nothing will make any difference. Second criticism is that existentialism emphasizes the negative aspect of life, all that is mean or base, and that it's pessimistic, that it's a dark philosophy. Thirdly, criticism that existentialism emphasizes the isolated individual or an alienated self. Hence, it cannot attain to solidarity with others. There's no way to connect with your fellow man. And lastly, the criticism that if existentialism, which Sartre does as an atheist, rejects God, there is no foundation for morality. Everyone can do whatever they want, and no one can legitimately judge anyone else. So these are the criticisms. In the rest of the essay, as I said, Sartre will give his responses. We'll look at that next. Well, the first response is the shortest, which is nice. Sartre responds that existentialism is not an invitation to passivity. That instead, it emphasizes actions. We are what we do, and that according to the existentialists, it's not only necessary to choose, but it's also necessary to act. So we have to choose how that we're going to act. So it doesn't help anybody not to make choices or not to act. It's absolutely necessary according to the existentialist program. The second response kind of has to acknowledge that there's some truth in this idea that existentialism is pessimism. I mean, so in a sense, it is true that existentialism is pessimistic, since there is no external help that one can appeal to. But Sartre wants to point out it's just as much optimistic because in the process we find ourselves and we can take control over who and what we are. If you remember when we talked about Nietzsche, I mean, Nietzsche was influenced by Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer was openly pessimistic. You could say, I think Nietzsche was kind of pessimistic too. I mean, and in both cases, there is some sort of darkness in these kinds of philosophies. But Sartre doesn't deny that exactly. He's just saying that there's a bright side to seeing things the way that they are. And then you discover the truth about yourself, and therefore gives you an opportunity to take control of your existence and what you are, who you're going to be. So we can be free. We are free, and we can be responsible for ourselves as well. There is, what I talked about earlier about the burden of being free and responsible. It brings anxiety. It brings a kind of anguish into your existence, but that seems to be just the price of it, of taking control of your life. Well, the third response is about existentialism, focusing on ourselves as isolated individuals. And so, again, you can say that it's true that we do discover ourselves as, or at least Sartre thinks we discover ourselves as isolated individuals. And he actually goes back and cites Descartes, I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum, as the beginning point for, uh, as the legitimate starting point. I'm not sure what he means here, so in what sense this is the starting point, but uh, nonetheless, he sees it as the starting point. And so you say here our individuality reveals itself. Uh, and you could say, what does it mean to find yourself? I just want to raise that momentarily. That this, say the existentialists say you find yourself in existence. If you think, what experience do I have in which I discover myself? And you could say that I think it happens in everybody's life at some point. You know, you just go on. Everything is uh, just given. You know, then at a certain point, you don't think about things, and then at a certain point, you have this kind of revelation. You know, that well, here I am. You know, and I'm this kind of person in this kind of situation, and so forth. And that's kind of like the starting point for uh, realizing that I have a choice, you know, that I can do something about who I am, what my circumstances are, you know, what my direction is, and all that. So that's, you know, that's all has something to do with this idea of having a starting point. So I find myself in existence. And, you know, you could say that here I don't find myself really by myself. Say our individual, although in some sense, you know, that's what I guess what Sartre is saying. I do find myself by myself, but at the same time, I also find myself in a world with others. Uh, we find ourselves in a community with others, and I and I experience others as creatures who are like myself, who are also free and can make choices the same way as I can. You can read about this in Heidegger's accounts. You know, Heidegger likes to talk about Dasein. I think he says that we find ourselves in the world. When we find ourselves in the world. We're somewhere, you know, and we find ourselves with others. And in a very strong sense, we are who we are as a result of our interactions with other people. So we're not really isolated. Maybe just for an instant, we see ourselves as independent, but also we find ourselves in a community of fellow human beings like ourselves. Okay, the last response. This is to the criticism that there's no foundation for morality, especially if you say there is no God. Sartre's response here is that when we find ourselves as free, and we find ourselves with others who we also experience as being free. So, as I just said earlier, we find ourselves within a community of others. And this provides me with a kind of guideline for a kind of humanistic ethics. This is really the thrust of Heidegger's title for this essay, Existentialism as a Humanism. So the value of freedom, value of honesty, both of these seem to have some legitimacy for myself as I find myself. And it's because I find myself in this community of others who are like me. For Sartre goes even a little bit further with this, and he argues that this means that when I choose alternatives for myself, I also choose for everyone else. When I choose the kind of life I wish to live, I also help determine with my example what it means to be a human being. So when I make my choices, I help determine the possibilities that human beings can have. So this is, you know, pretty interesting. This sort of shift to the humanistic basis of existentialism. Camus expresses a very similar thought when he says the following: "Don't walk in front of me, I may not follow. Don't walk behind me, I may not lead, but walk beside me, be my friend." Hard not to like this quote. It sort of expresses our solidarity with everyone else. We're all members of a community of equals.